Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Maren Show. My name is Jonathon Maren, and today we're going to be talking to a pro-life intellectual, author, and former communist about the state of the abortion wars here in the United States, how we got here, and what the last several decades have been like. That's coming right up. Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us again this week. Today, we're going to be talking to Marvin Olasky, the author of over 20 books, the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, a former communist, and the author of several essential and important books, not only on abortion, but on the American abortion wars, how abortion has impacted American history, and what things not only look like over the past several decades, but going forward. I've been reading Marvin Olasky's books for years. They were some of the first books given to me about abortion in my own career as a pro-life activist, and I've wanted to have him on the show for quite some time. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. All right, the first question I want to ask you, and I hadn't originally planned to ask you this question, but I noticed going through your bio just prior to the interview that you actually were a communist for a while. Tell us about this transition from communism into being one of the most recognized pro-life authors during the late 80s and 90s.
Well, yeah, try to keep it short here. I grew up in Judaism, and as is unfortunately pretty typical these days, bar mitzvah at 13, atheist at 14. So as an atheist, I kept moving further and further to the left, Marxism, communism, joined the Communist Party in 1972 after being involved in a variety of anti-war stuff and poverty demonstrations. God intervened. I came to believe over the 3 years from 1973 to 1976 that a God of some kind existed. I came to believe this really not through any concentrated study, but basically God demolishing my pretenses and through a variety of providential circumstances coming to learn more about him, none of which I designed or planned myself. For example, and I'll just give you two quick examples. I was in graduate school at the University of Michigan, and to get a PhD, you have to have a good reading knowledge of a foreign language. My language was Russian that I had learned some of. I had traveled across the Pacific on a Soviet freighter and then across the Soviet Union, Trans-Siberian Railroad, planning to become essentially a Soviet agent. But God intervened. I had enough Russian to keep working at it, and one time, just in my room, I looked up. I was trying to get some reading practice in Russian, and I had a copy of the New Testament in Russian that had been given to me a couple of years before, and I held on to it as kind of a souvenir item, an oddity, and just started reading through it, and it just blew me away that I thought this was not something that man, through our own minds, had devised. This was something coming from God. That impressed me. But again, I wasn't doing it to be impressed. I was doing it to study Russian, and that I learned a lot in the process. I had to teach a course. I was assigned to teach a course in early American literature as a graduate student. None of the regular professors wanted to teach that. They wanted to teach exotic subjects, so it fell to me to do it because it was still in the curriculum. What was early American literature? Puritan sermons. So these dead white males from 300 years ago were preaching to me. I grew up, I think, believing that Christians were stupid. The Puritans, these divines, certainly were not stupid. So they impressed me. And over several years, other things happened. I won't go through the details now, but I ended up in 1976 professing faith in Christ and joining a church. And through God's grace, that's where I have been for the past 43 years, and I hope to continue.
So that's a rather whirlwind summary, and there's a few threads I'm tempted to pull out there, but I guess for the purpose of this discussion, when did you first become aware of the abortion issue, and what was your first introduction to the pro-life movement?
Well, first became aware of it. I was an undergraduate at Yale, and I remember one class where there was a discussion of this, and this was, the pro-abortion movement was starting to take off in the late '60s, and it was very clear, as I recall from that discussion, that all thoughtful people were on the pro-abortion side, and everything else was just superstition. Because we are creatures of material only. There's a struggle for survival. The weak, as we had learned from Charles Darwin and others, would not really survive, and so be it. Better off for the progress of humanity. That little children, unborn kids, or globules, little pieces of matter, would get out of the way when their parents were unable or unwilling to take care of them. They would be a drain in our society, so get rid of them. So that was really my thinking. It was also certainly convenient for guys,
right,
in college and graduate school. I certainly thought that as I committed adultery and so forth, if there were any problems, and the women were responsible for taking care of it. So it was ideological, but also convenient. Sort of the Playboy philosophy was very convenient in that way, and abortion fit very well in it. So that's what I was thinking, and I almost in graduate school, when I was thinking of dissertation topics, I was almost going to write one on population control, overpopulation, and so forth, and that certainly would have led me further down the pro-abortion path, but decided not to do that, did other things, and kept, just thinking this through here, because I really haven't thought about what I believed. I haven't thought a lot about what I believed about abortion at that point, but I certainly saw it as convenient. I certainly saw it as the right thing to do in macro terms, and then I probably didn't think about it at all for several years. The personal situation, I'm thankful to God for that, never came up where I had to push abortion for personal reasons. So it was off in the distance. I suspect in January 1973, as I recall, I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it, but I was glad of the Roe v. Wade decision. And not until I got married in 1976, and my wife and I, both as baby Christians, started going to church and thinking about it, did we actually take this seriously? We were in Wilmington, Delaware. I was a speechwriter for executives at the DuPont Company for about 5 years. We were in an Orthodox Presbyterian church there, and this is where we started to hear about it. I'm not quite sure exactly how, but it seemed just as reasonable and righteous in an atheistic sense as abortion seemed to me when I was a communist. It now all seemed to be wrong, because I had a sense of God creating us, God creating every individual person. So don't think I really thought it through in any kind of intellectual way, but it just seemed wrong, and it seemed wrong to my wife. She became a volunteer counselor at Crisis Pregnancy Center in Delaware. This was right near the beginning of the Crisis Pregnancy Center movement.
Right.
I think she got involved in that in 1981. So she was a counselor. After writing speeches for 5 years, I wanted to do some writing of my own. University of Texas offered me a job. So I went. So we moved to Texas. We had, at that point, 2 children of our own, and we then had born two more. So we were there, and I thought we were going to Austin so I could teach at the University of Texas. I think what God really had in store was my wife. After her experience in Delaware, we came to Austin, where it was a very pro-abortion city, and there was no crisis pregnancy center. So she started one in 1984, got it rolling, chaired it for a while, and it's still going. So I think that was the reason God brought us to Austin, and I'm very grateful for that. So she was involved then setting up the Crisis Pregnancy Center, and I was involved teaching history in a journalism department, and started wondering what the history of abortion was, and started doing some research and writing some articles. Several of them co-authored with her. I mean, she was the one who really led me into actual practice. I chaired the Crisis Pregnancy Center for a while after she was done with that, and then writing about it and getting into the history of abortion. So, yeah, both in practice and then writing, and then also we were involved at this point in the 1980s. There were folks emphasizing the importance of which was then true then and still true now of bringing pregnant women into our homes. If their parents and boyfriends kicked them out, where were they to go? So we actually had one woman who lived with us for 9 months and bore her child very, very bravely, and so we were involved in a lot of ways like that, both personally and in terms of nonprofit activities with the Crisis Pregnancy Center, and then writing.
So when I look at the dates that your books were being published, right? Prodigal Press, The Anti-Christian Bias of American News Media came out in 1988, as did The Press on Abortion, 1838 to 1988. And these books on the history of the American nation, of American Christianity, of the slow move towards a bias against those things were taking place against the backdrop of a rising religious right. And you were more peripherally involved, but yet still involved. What are your memories of the rise of the religious right, Operation Rescue, the more aggressive tactics that the movement took in those days, especially as while this was unfolding, you were looking at the last 100 years or more of what had taken place preceding this all?
Right. Well, I really wasn't involved politically with the religious right at all during the 1980s. So as I think back at it, it was really looking at history and coming to some conclusions from the history. One that I learned about is that there was a lot of abortion back well before Roe v. Wade. So it wasn't as if the problem just began in 1973. You go back to colonial times, and there were some abortions, mostly infanticide, but some abortions, and then really developed with the growth of cities and the spread of prostitution in the 1830s. Prostitutes had lots of abortions. There was a spiritist movement that became very strong in the United States in the 1850s, and a lot of those folks, for a mixture of theological reasons and just personal preferences and satisfactions, a lot of abortions there. Urbanization, lots of abortions. I mean, the old story of the factory owner or the son of the factory owner seducing and then abandoning a young woman coming off the farms and not having any friends and falling into the clutches of a person who just wanted to use her for his own satisfaction. So lots of abortions there. That's the history I was learning, and that cut across some of our tendency to think the good old days were wonderful and it all just started with Roe v. Wade. Another thing that I learned from history is the important role of the press. And again, I was writing, I mean, as a journalist and a columnist, and so I was very interested in this. But just seeing the way in the 19th century the New York Times, first under the editorship of Henry Raymond, who was a thoughtful Presbyterian guy, and then his successors, the New York Times, really led the battle against abortion. The Times started in 1851. There was some of that through the 1850s and the 1860s, but it really picked up in 1871. The New York Times had an article called "The Evil of the Age." They sent a reporter named St. Clair undercover into abortion businesses. So I wrote about that and saw the importance of that. At the same time, newspapers were exposing the abortionists, and often in very direct and clear ways. They did not shilly-shally about this evil of the age. A lot of other newspapers, including those newspapers that in the news columns were criticizing abortion, they also were getting money by abortionists who set up who created very thinly veiled ads for abortion after stoppage of menses. And well, what's the reason the menses stops? Well, it's because pregnancy.
Right.
What do you do about it? Well, you take some art abortifacients. Abortion. Well, there are a lot of. I won't go into the details here, but you take something. It's very similar in in some ways, RU-486 today, and a lot of women were getting chemical abortions in that way. There were surgical abortions. So there was lots of it, and newspapers were busy in exposing it. So that was the second big thing, the role of the press, and then the way the press turned around, starting early in the 20th century, but then building and building and building in the 1950s and the 1960s. So that was another part of the story that both positively and negatively, media were crucial in the early expansion, then contraction, and then expansion again of abortion. A third thing I learned, and again, this is largely by reading old newspapers and old accounts and reading testimony from physicians, sermons, a whole lot of stuff that eventually went into these two books that I wrote that started out as articles in the academic journals. The role of compassion. In the late 19th century, Christians were highly involved in developing ministries and charities to help pregnant women in lots of ways, including places where they could go to have their children, and often these places did not have nice names. One of the places I learned about the most and read the records of was called the Erring, E-R-R-I-N-G, the Erring Women's Refuge.
Oh.
And I remember spending a couple of days in the Chicago Historical Society just reading the monthly records over 20 years from a woman named Helen Mercy Woods. This home for wayward women, as they put it in those days. So, and then the ways to try to help women not to get pregnant, including when they came into cities from the farm for jobs, places they could stay, which would be safe, entertainment, so they wouldn't just be so emotionally starved and bored that some guy could come along and get them into trouble. A whole lot of things, just many different things that were not exactly like our crisis pregnancy centers these days, but similar in some ways, and emphasizing compassion. So I think those are the three main lessons I learned from the research. There was lots of abortion, there was a lot of press activity, and there was a lot of compassionate activity.
What was the primary thesis of your 1992 book, Abortion Rights, spelled R-I-T-E-S, A Social History of Abortion in America? I know compassion was a key part of that, but this book I created quite a splash at the time when it was released.
Well, it made a splash, but of an unusual kind. I was on leave for 2 years from the University of Texas, and my family and I, we lived in Washington, and I spent a lot of time in the Library of Congress. And out of that came 2 books, and the reception of the books was very different, and I eventually figured out why. The first book was American Passion, and it was a history of poverty fighting in America,
Right.
And looked at the way we fought poverty pretty successfully, starting in colonial days, but up in the 19th century, early 20th century. And it wasn't government led. It was compassion, basically, and churches and synagogues and private charities helping people who are poor. I won't go through the whole history here, but that book had a real constituency because there was a big debate at the time about welfare reform, and this book was saying and showing historically how, without the government being involved, Americans helped the poor and helped people come out of poverty and actually work better than our war on poverty of the past 50 years now. Largely government-led and largely enabling people to stay in poverty rather than helping them through personal help, challenging help, spiritual help to come out of it. So you could see there was a natural constituency for there in the sense, small government people loved it, big government people hated it. And it eventually sold lots of copies and probably had an impact on the welfare debates of the 1990s. Then, same process of spending a lot of time in the Library of Congress reading old records, with a stacks pass, going into the stacks and reading these documents that literally blowing dust off them. They just sat on shelves for perhaps decades, and just reading about what people did and developing compassionate approaches. That led to this abortion book, Abortion Rights, RITES. But the reception of that was very different because it did not have a natural constituency. People on the pro-abort side disliked it because it was coming from a pro-life position. But a lot of people on the pro-life side also didn't like it because what I teased out through looking at these reports from the early 19th century is that there was lots of abortion back then. And folks on our side, it complicated the matter. There was lots of abortion back then. And I also concluded that law certainly contributes to it. The development of some legal action in starting a little bit early in the century, but then stepping up a lot in the 1870s, that helped. But I don't think it was really crucial. Because even when there were strong anti-abortion laws, they weren't enforced all that often. It was difficult at that time, in terms of a court of law, to not just difficult, but virtually impossible in a court of law to show to the satisfaction of the jury that up before 4.5 months or so before quickening, the woman actually was proven to be pregnant. So, a lot of abortions were occurring, and legal action could help, but I don't think it was all that crucial. And our side really did not want to hear that because we focused on Roe v. Wade, we focused on legal change more than cultural change. So it did not have a real constituency among pro-life people either. That's sort of my orphan book in a way. I think it languished because it did not have a natural constituency pushing it as the book on poverty fighting and welfare had.
When you look at what you discovered for your books, because I think that most people, even most people in the pro-life movement, are not particularly aware of the history of abortion prior to Roe, which is why I thought Daniel K. Williams' book was so valuable. And for many young pro-lifers, the 80s and the early 90s were a long time ago already. Many of them will not have any conscious memories of the rescue movement and all these other movements that came up during that time. But based on what you've read and having a context that goes, well, I read some of your essays that go all the way back to the time of the Puritans. What sort of mistakes and what sort of successes do you think the pro-life movement had in the from the mid '80s to coming up to the Bush presidency?
Bush 1 or Bush 2?
Bush 2.
Okay. Well, there's another part of the story that I touched on a few years ago in one article, but have never really developed fully. In the late '80s, with Operation Rescue, and I knew a lot of Operation people, thought they were genuine and gutsy, but I don't think overall it helped. It may have helped. I mean, and by the testimony, it may have helped some women who had more time to think about it. There are babies who were born because of Operation Rescue who otherwise probably would not have been born. So it was a great thing in that way. But in terms of public opinion, it probably really set things back, and thus it probably you don't know about these things, but it probably ended up as a net loss in terms of saving lives because the pro-life movement started to be characterized as a movement of nasty people, young white males harassing women, including women of color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it really hurt, I think, in that way. It helped in some very specific ways, and I honor that, and I'm glad for that. I think overall it was probably harmful for the pro-life cause generally, and that's looking at it at the end of the 1980s and early in the 1990s. I really disagreed with the usefulness of it overall, but it was hard to disagree because it did save some lives. But I had lots of discussions with Randy Terry, and he was really, and I actually asked him to straight out, well, what is this going to result in? Are we going to have a civil war in this? And he said, yeah, I just want to intensify the conflict. And if I turn off 97 people, but 3 people become real warriors, then that's a net plus. And I basically disagreed with that. And I hope there were ways we would avoid having a civil war in this country if we could convince a lot of people in what was called the mushy middle to come over to our side. Then you would start having pro-life. You'd start having culturally people becoming pro-life, and that cultural change down the road would lead to legal change, political change, and a lot of many fewer kids being aborted and lots of lives being saved. So that was the argument I had with some Operation Rescue people. And again, I appreciate their guts, I appreciate their intensity and their desire to save lives. But I tended to go with Abraham Lincoln, who talked about the importance of public opinion. So that's where we were. It wasn't a happy situation at that point because the argument was very intense. I was involved with a group called Fieldstead, basically a foundation in California, in developing a series of books, which were called, I think, the Turning Point Christian Worldview Series. We eventually came out with 16 books on a variety of subjects. And one of the perspective books was about abortion, and it tried to take, a thoughtful look at Operation Rescue, and in the course of, it's funny the way this turned out, in the course of discussing this, we come out with this book, How would people pay attention to it? What could we do? It originally, as almost a public relations idea, someone suggested, well, what if we have a meeting of pro-life leaders, and we'll discuss this, and we can pass out copies of the book. Also, it almost began as that type of book promotional thing.
Right.
But if I started thinking about it, it could be something much more, because what I was learning, just as a journalist and hearing this from various people, is that it wasn't just Operation Rescue versus the more conventional pro-life movement at that time, but within that pro-life movement, there were just huge differences. Part of it came to constitutional amendment or this, what the particular strategy was. But essentially, there was a battle between what we came to call the all or something people versus the all or nothing people. And the all or nothing people said, we need to have a constitutional amendment. And, if people are talking about ways of saving particular children, or if people are going to legislate and say that there can be protection up to protection after a certain age of gestation, that's no good. It's all or nothing. And then there was the all or something people. And I just gravitated, I guess, from the study of history that I'd done, I gravitated to the all or something people because I saw that's how it worked successfully in the 19th century, to save lots of kids and actually lower the number of abortions back then. And, we save as many as we can. We keep pushing. Hadley Arcus, a friend of mine who was a professor at Amherst, really had start at the in a sense start with the most radical pro-abortion thing and undermine that, namely what we now call partial birth abortion. Make people aware of that, protect those kids, and then you start moving. Okay, if we're willing to protect kids at 9 months, just at the time they're being born, then why not 8 months? Why not 7 months? Why not 5 months? Why not 3 months? And just keep moving that way. That was basically the all or something position. The other debate was, well, should you, if you're discussing this culturally or you're discussing laws, should you allow any exceptions in terms of obviously protecting the health of the mother was not really a good thing to be pushing for, because health was viewed so expansively that it would allow anything. But protecting the life of the mother, or what about the other classic hard cases of rape and incest? Are you willing to culturally and legislatively allow some exceptions? And again, the all or something position was, yeah, you're willing to do that, and then you keep pushing. Why not? Even when there's a rape, I mean, the child is an innocent person in that rape, so why kill that child? But keep pushing on that. Just keep trying to increase the protection, more and more and more kids. So that was the battle. And as it turned out, this thing that started as a book promotion idea then became, at least in my mind, and I think the minds of other people, is there a way that rather than pro-life people turning our fire upon each other, can we agree on some things to disagree, but really turn our fire on the pro-abortion folks? We had a meeting in Washington in 1989, the initial meeting, where we invited people, heads of all the groups, including Nellie Gray from March for Life, Judy Brown, the National Right to Life people, Americans United for Life, and headed by Guy Condon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we got all these people in one room in the Capitol under the auspices of a senator at that time who was helpful to us, people with differences managed to get along, and essentially there was burying the hatchet not in each other, but putting in the ground and spending less time attacking each other. Parallel in some ways to the whole question of intelligent design and creationism versus evolution. sometimes young Earth and old Earth people are attacking each other. They're not the enemies. There are other folks out there that you should concentrate on. So this happened and led to a series of quarterly meetings, originally called the Fieldstead Forums, and then the Life Forums. One person from Fieldstead chaired them initially. When I was in Washington, I chaired them for a year or so, and then other people, Connie Marshner and others, took over. I think that historically made a huge difference in the pro-life movement. Not attacking each other, and Anyway, I could go on about it, but I think that was a crucial turning point back in 1989.
Coming up to the 2000s, one of the things I was very interested to ask you, because you at least peripherally knew him, when was the first time you met George W. Bush?
Oh, first time was in 1993 when he was starting to run for governor. Karl Rove, his political aide, had read this book of mine on helping the poor, The Tragedy of American Compassion, and he wanted George W. to be aware of it and some of the arguments, because that was going to be one of the arguments in the 1994 gubernatorial elections concerning welfare reform. And so, we met for about an hour, and I explained in my roundabout, not very not well structured way, just what some of the issues were. But Bush is a smart guy, and he understood what some of these things were, and he got it because his own history had been as a young man drinking pretty heavily, and then he came to a belief in Christ, and that changed his life. So if in poverty fighting, it's important not just to pass out some money to folks, but help them develop spiritually as well. I mean, he understood that. So and then periodically through the 1990s, we got together, and as situations arose, just talk these through a little bit. There was, once he was governor in 1995, there was an attempt by Texas Regulatory, an anti-alcoholism, anti-addiction organization, and that's national, that had a branch in San Antonio, Teen Challenge. And I wrote about that in World. I wrote about it in the Wall Street Journal, and suddenly, and put in actually in World. I don't think I've ever done this another time, but send your cards and letters to Governor George W. Bush, and here's the address. And I got a lot of mail, and I got a call from him. Come over and let's talk about this. And what do I do? And we talked it through, and that led to him creating a study group that recommended 3 pieces of legislation that the next legislature actually passed. So that was useful. But once we had this a certain, very informal relationship, I wanted to talk with him about abortion a little bit, and get him committed to some things that would be very helpful. Mm-hmm. And so he agreed. This goes on. He's running for president at this point in 1999. We brought in some pro-life people, several people from around the country, just to talk with him about trying to create a culture of life. I had worked there, had sort of had a plan for this hour of presentation. This person would do this, and the next person would build on it. But he really wanted to cut to the chase.
Right.
And I think understood this. What particularly then could we propose? And actually had a proposal for him about helping crisis pregnancy centers get ultrasound machines. They were somewhat of a new thing at that time.
Right. When you spoke to George Bush, now President Bush, about abortion, what was your sense of how he felt about the issue? Because one of the things that's been unfortunate but interesting about the Republican presidents is typically, especially in the case of George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, their personal conviction about abortion seems sincere, but none of their children or their wives are interested in the issue or are on our side of the fence on that issue.
Right. Right. The sense I got is that he understood this. He was against abortion, and he understood that it was a primarily a cultural battle that would then have political and legislative consequences. So the proposal that he accepted, that we made at this meeting in 1999, was that there was a program, and I have to go back and review the specifics, but there was a program where the feds would finance equipment purchases for clinics of various kinds. And thus, within this program, the feds could pay for ultrasound machines, which were just starting, and at that point, expensive. A lot of our small CPCs couldn't afford them, but here the feds would pay for them, and so you'd be able to equip hundreds of centers with ultrasound much more quickly than would otherwise be the case through long and painful fundraising that was beyond the ability of some smaller groups. So, yeah, he said, here's the proposal. He said, yeah, I'm for it. I'll have my staff people look into it and and they did. And the story I was told, he was already he was ready to introduce this in a speech, and then the day before, I think it was Pat Buchanan who entered the race for president, and I'd have to go back and look exactly the dates of this and how that happened, but the very last moment, this thing that he was going to propose, and it was all worked out, he decided, well, no, let's just shelve it for a while, because we don't want it to seem that we're just reacting to someone further to the right, in that sense, coming in. We don't want to acknowledge that, because they had the sense that they could roll through the primaries, and that's pretty much what happened. And they did not want to be seen as just responding to some other candidate in that way. And what happened, sadly, is that it got tabled, and then other things moved on, and so it never actually became part. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean he wasn't sincere? I think he was in that, but it wasn't a big thing in his mind the way some other things were. So, some positives, some negatives about that.
Right, yes, because on a previous episode of this podcast, Austin Ruse of CFAM says that one of the reasons why the Trump administration at the United Nations has actually been more pro-life in terms of what the people there are trying to implement than the Bush administration was not because George Bush was not pro-life in his convictions, but because essentially after 9/11, his entire administration got turned into one that faced was exclusively a foreign policy administration, so the compassionate conservatism thing never really got off the ground, and essentially what I've heard from some people who got involved in Republican politics at the time is the thing that they think about a lot is what could the Bush presidency have been if it hadn't been for the war on terror. What's your view on that?
Well, I wrote a lot about this at the time concerning the poverty fighting aspects, that there was a discussion among Bush advisors in 1999 and 2000. There was agreement that it was important not to just have the government continuing to expand, but to enable and empower community groups, nonprofits, including churches and synagogues, and have them involved in poverty fighting, in pro-life activities, etc. And what could the government do to help? And there were two different views of how to do that. One was a centralizing view, one was a decentralizing view. The centralizing view was that you would continue the grant system that you had, where people in Washington would make grants to various groups, which could include crisis pregnancy centers, as well as poverty-fighting groups of other kinds. But you wouldn't really change the structure. You would just try to have better decision-making on the part of the central authorities in Washington. And they would not discriminate against religious groups. Religious groups would be helped to participate by, you would train them in applying for government grants. That was view number one, the centralizing view. View number two, the decentralizing view, was one that I tried to carry forward, and there were some other people also. And that was, yes, these groups need more funding. The way to do it is through having a charity tax credit, where individuals and couples could contribute to a variety of groups, whether secular or Christian or whatever religion, but they could do it. It would be their choice, and they'd be able to take a certain percentage of that, much higher than a deduction, which might be 15 or 28 or 33%, but they'd be able to have a tax credit, which could be 50% or 75%, and that would really help groups, including crisis pregnancy centers, get more funding, because individuals then would often calculate, well, how much can I afford out of pocket? And as is often the case in political campaigns, basically Bush and his political advisors said, okay, let's talk about both. And they did during the campaign. So there was both the creating a level playing field for federal funds that would be administered from Washington, and then also empowering individuals to give more through charitable tax credits. I won't go through all the details here, but the person who everyone thought and I thought was going to implement this was former mayor of Indianapolis, Steve Goldsmith, who understood this very well and basically wanted both approaches, but leaned toward the decentralist approach, or so he was telling me, for a whole variety of complicated personnel and personal reasons. Goldsmith did not get that job. The fellow who did get the job was John DiIulio, a good guy from the University of Pennsylvania, but John very committed to the centralizing approach, and will administer the grants from Washington. So even before 9/11, the faith-based initiative in Washington in its first 8 months had taken a wrong turn and was getting pummeled from all sides. Christians saying, we don't want to just become people begging the federal government for funds. We want it decentralized. And then liberal groups complaining that religious groups would be allowed to get these funds, which previously had gone almost entirely to secular liberal groups. So, I would like to think that 9/11, everything would have really turned out differently, apart from 9/11. But at least as far as this is concerned, I'm really not sure that's the case. It had already taken a wrong turn. What 9/11 did was basically solidified that turn and made it impossible to get it back in at least what I thought would be the right direction. Because after that, the attention just wasn't there. It became a war administration rather than a compassionate conservative administration.
Final question. Donald J. Trump is leading the Republican Party. The old Republican Party and the old consensus seems to be broken. At least it is in the minds of many analysts and commentators. And the culture wars seem to be in this very strange stage where the pro-life movement is winning a lot of victories. As you know, hundreds of laws were passed on the state level during Barack Obama, but at the same time, you have the transgender phenomenon sweeping across the country. So what's your analysis of where we are and where we go from here?
Well, short range, the Trump administration has been good for pro-life groups. And just in terms of not that there's been that much coming out of Washington, but yeah, a lot of useful legislation in states, and Trump's pronouncements, his pro-life pronouncements, have been very good. Yeah, much stronger than previous presidents. So all that is good. The problem, though, is more long range. Number one, if the pro-life message now is coming predominantly from a person who is very unpopular among the young, particularly, but among lots of others, is that helpful in the long run? Yes, people are hearing this, but if they don't have confidence in the messenger, then what? So are we solidifying the pro-life groups of a minority, but making them less tenable among the majority? That's just one long-range concern. I don't have a definite answer to that, but that really concerns me. And then going broader than that, from the pro-life movement to family questions generally. Is the messenger Donald Trump someone who is in his personal life someone to look up to, or is this going to lead lots of people, a majority of people, to say, well, he's saying these things for political reasons. His life, his whole history belies that. Politics in the United States is very much carried into, or is very much aligned with personality. It's very strange that we send out in single challengers like medieval knights, one candidate against another candidate, and very often the crucial swing vote will be concerned with the personality of the candidate rather than the positions or principles that's involved, and the identities of the thousands of people then who would form his administration. So, is Donald Trump the single champion that we want? I mean, that's the problem. I like a lot of the things he's done. I also dislike some of the things he's done in terms of if we are pro-life, but yet we are imprisoning kids at the border. Then what? How does that make us look to lots of people who are not just judging by the words, but judging by actions?
Right.
So those are all problems. I am glad that we have a president who voices pro-life sentiments and does what he can to cut down on funding going to Planned Parenthood, and that is certainly the appointment of his appointment of two judges who seem to be pro-life. That's also important. It's encouraged a lot of this legislation on the local level, and just encouraged pro-life people all over. Will these two judges will they vote in favor of overturning Roe v. Wade? Maybe yes, maybe no. It would certainly be good to get rid of Roe v. Wade. That's not going to. That would be a great help, but it's not going to eliminate abortion by itself. Since again, as I've studied historically, laws have some impact, but not as much as cultural changes. So I am concerned, in other words, with the cultural movement, particularly among millennials, and the way that if the person voicing a certain pro-life sentiment is someone who is looked upon and as not a good person, then is that going to tarnish the pro-life words that this person utters? Short range, benefit, long range, I still don't know, and I am concerned.
Well, Dr. Olasky, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss all these issues with us.
Well, thank you, and just one other thought on this question.
Mm-hmm.
As a Christian, I think the most important thing that we do, even in fighting pro-life battles, we are there to save the lives of children. We are also there to glorify God, and we hope enjoy Him forever. So anything that leads to increased scorn for the Bible, for Christ, for glorifying God, I mean, that's a problem too. So I'm just, I have very mixed feelings about President Trump, liking a lot of stuff, but really concerned about the long range results.
Right. Makes sense. Ladies and gentlemen, that was my conversation with Marvin Olasky, author, editor-in-chief of World Magazine and pro-life intellectual. If you want to check out any other podcasts, former podcasts, head over to lifesitenews.com and click on the podcast tab. You can get our podcast on any of the platforms where you get your podcasts. If you want to check out other important life and family news, again, you can head over to lifesitenews.com. I write a couple of columns there a week, and there's a lot of really important articles on really important issues to keep you up to date with what's going on in the culture wars. Thanks so much again for joining us this week, and we do hope you'll join us again next week.